Welcome to our deep dive. And today we're tackling a debate that's been going on for centuries. Idealism versus materialism. You've given us a ton of material to explore this philosophical showdown. We've got those ancient Greek philosophers facing off. We've got deep dives into Plato's theory of forms, Hegel's pretty mind-bending ideas. We've even got some modern Marxist theory thrown in there.
Yeah, it's a real mix. It's like a philosophical buffet. And it's great for this kind of deep dive because it really shows how this debate has really shaped how we think over time and still pops up even today.
Okay, so let's set the stage here. It sounds like you've got some pretty big questions you want to wrestle with, like what shapes our reality? Is it our minds? Is it the physical world around us? Or could it even be something else entirely? And with sources ranging from YouTube videos to like actual philosophical texts, it seems like you are ready for a deep dive indeed.
Absolutely. And one thing I find really fascinating is that this whole debate, idealism versus materialism, it's not just an academic thing. You know, it has some real world implications, you know, how we understand everything from ethics and politics to even science and technology.
So you're saying this isn't just some dusty old philosophical debate. This stuff actually matters in the real world.
Oh, it definitely matters. Think about it if you believe, like Plato, that the true reality lies in this world of perfect, unchanging forms that might lead you to really value reason and contemplation above all else.
Right, it's like those prisoners in Plato's allegory of the cave. They just see shadows on the wall.
Right.
But the real forms are outside, just waiting to be discovered through reason.
Exactly. But if, on the other hand, you're more inclined towards the materialism side, you might place a lot more emphasis on empirical evidence. You know, what we can see and touch and measure, and the role of that physical world in shaping our understanding of things.
So it's almost like two totally different lenses for looking at the world, and that shapes how we interpret everything.
And that's why it's so crucial to really understand both sides of the argument. It lets us think critically about our own assumptions and biases.
Okay, so that makes sense. So where do we want to jump in first? Should we start with those ancient Greeks? They seem like they kind of started this whole thing. Or should we just jump right into Plato's theory of form?
You know, I think it makes sense to start with Plato. His theory of forms is kind of like this foundational concept for idealism, and it'll provide a good springboard for exploring some of the other ideas.
Okay, so Plato, you're up. And one of the videos you sent explains this theory really well. It uses that allegory of the cave. For our listeners who might not be familiar, can you quickly walk us through that?
Yeah, of course. So picture this. Imagine a group of prisoners. They're chained inside a cave. Their whole lives, they've been there. And all they can see are these shadows that are projected on the wall. The shadows are caused by objects passing in front of the fire. But to them, those shadows are reality.
It's like a really messed up shadow puppet show.
Exactly. But then one of the prisoners escapes, and he goes outside and sees the real objects that were causing those shadows. He understands that those shadows are just imperfect copies of the true forms.
That's got to be a mind-blowing experience, going from a world of shadows to suddenly seeing the real deal.
And it's a really powerful metaphor. You know, Plato believed that these forms, these ideal forms, are eternal, perfect blueprints for everything that we see in the physical world.
So like the form of a tree is like the perfect essence of treeness. And all the trees we see are just like imperfect copies trying to live up to that ideal.
That's it. And this idea has had a huge impact, not just in philosophy, but even on religion and art.
So Plato's basically saying that the physical world we experience is kind of like a knockoff version of a much grander and truer reality. That's a different way of looking at it.
Absolutely. And it raises all sorts of questions about, you know, how we even acquire knowledge, what we should value, and even the nature of beauty and goodness.
Hold on, we're getting deep here. I like it. So how does this theory of forms actually play out in this whole debate between idealism and materialism?
Well, for Plato, the forms are like the ultimate reality, the foundation of everything. They exist independently of the physical world and even our minds. This definitely puts them in the idealist camp.
Right, because idealism is all about the mind. Consciousness is fundamental to reality.
Exactly. For idealists, the material world is either a product of the mind or, at the very least, secondary to it.
So in this philosophical showdown, Plato's basically throwing down a gauntlet saying mind over matter.
That's a good way to put it. And while not all idealists agree with every detail of Plato's theory of forms, the core idea that consciousness plays this primary role in shaping reality remains really central to the idealist perspective. And this is where the debate really gets interesting, because if idealism says that the mind is kind of in the driver's seat, materialism kind of pumps the brakes and says, hold on, it's the stuff of the world, the material conditions. Those are the things that really shape us.
Okay, so now we're shifting gears a bit. We're going from like the realm of these perfect forms to the actual nitty-gritty of the material world.
Exactly. And while we have sources that cover different flavors of materialism, one that really stands out is historical materialism, which is often associated with Marxist thought.
Right, the idea that history is driven by economic forces, class struggles, and how we produce stuff. But honestly, sometimes I find historical materialism a little dense. Can you break that down for us a bit?
Sure. Think about how, like, the invention of new technologies like the printing press or the steam engine completely changed societies. These advancements led to new ways of working, producing goods, and organizing power.
So you're saying it's not just about abstract ideas floating around. The way we actually make stuff and distribute resources has a huge impact on our lives, even our beliefs.
Precisely. Historical materialism argues that those material conditions are like the foundation upon which everything else is built.
That's pretty radical when you think about it. Like our very thoughts are shaped by the tools we use and the economic systems we live under.
And it really challenges that idealist notion that ideas are the primary drivers of history. For historical materialists, it's the other way around. Material conditions shape our ideas.
That makes sense. But I've also heard some criticisms of historical materialism. Like it focuses too much on economics and ignores other important factors. What about like culture, religion, or even just individual choices? Don't those things matter?
Those are definitely valid criticisms. And even within Marxist thought, there's a lot of debate about how much emphasis to place on economic determinism versus other factors.
So it's not like a rigid formula where economics equals destiny.
Not at all. Think of historical materialism more like a framework for analysis, a way of understanding how those material conditions kind of create possibilities and limitations for human action. It's not about predicting the future, but recognizing those underlying forces that shape the landscape of history.
Okay, so on the one hand, we've got Plato saying it's all about these ideal blueprints. And then we have the historical materialists saying, no, it's the actual stuff, the means of production that drives everything. Kind of like this philosophical tug of war.
And that tension is what makes this whole debate so fascinating. It forces us to grapple with some big questions about human nature, the nature of reality, and how we make sense of it all.
It is fascinating. Because on the one hand, we have this incredible capacity for abstract thought. We can imagine things that don't exist. But then on the other hand, we're also very much grounded in this physical world. We're subject to its laws and limitations. There's like this constant dance between the ideal and the material.
And that dance is reflected in our sources, too. We have these deep dives into these philosophical concepts, but we also have material that connects these ideas to everyday life.
You're talking about those 9 life lessons from Plato. You know, at first I thought, oh, well, here comes the self-help stuff. But I was surprised by how those lessons actually get at the core of this idealism versus materialism debate.
Yeah, let's take Plato's emphasis on self-mastery. He believed that true freedom comes from conquering those impulses and aligning our choices with our higher values.
Right, like don't be a slave to your desires. Choose what's truly good and beautiful. But how does that tie into the idealism versus materialism thing?
Well, for Plato, those higher values, those ideals of goodness and beauty are rooted in the forms. They represent a higher reality, something that we should all strive for.
So self-mastery isn't just about personal discipline. It's about aligning ourselves with those eternal truths, those perfect blueprints that Plato talked about.
Exactly. It's about kind of transcending the limitations of the material world and accessing a higher realm of being.
It's a powerful idea, but also seems like a tough challenge, especially in a world that often bombards us with material desires and distractions.
It is a challenge, and this is where that tension between the ideal and the material really comes into play. We're constantly being pulled in both directions.
Right, like wanting the latest gadgets and experiences, but also feeling a yearning for something deeper, more meaningful.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people feel that tension, that struggle to reconcile those desires. It's like we're trying to bridge two different worlds.
This brings us to another one of Plato's life lessons that stood out to me, the importance of choosing your company wisely. He actually compared people to dirt, saying that they can either nourish or poison your growth.
That's a strong metaphor. It reminds us that the people we surround ourselves with have a really profound impact on our values and aspirations and ultimately our character.
And this idea of choosing your dirt wisely seems really relevant to the idealism versus materialism debate too, because the company we keep can pull us towards either a more materialistic way of living or a more idealistic way of living.
Absolutely. If we're constantly surrounded by people who value material possessions and status and external validation, it's going to be a lot harder to cultivate a focus on inner growth and the pursuit of those higher ideals.
It's like those prisoners in the cage.
Yeah.
If everyone around you only sees shadows, it's easy to believe that's all there is.
Exactly. But if we choose to surround ourselves with people who value wisdom and compassion and the pursuit of truth, we're more likely to be inspired and supported on our own journey of self-discovery and growth.
It's like creating our own little mini republic, a community that reflects those values and ideals we want to embody.
And that's a powerful idea, because it suggests that we have the power to shape our own reality, not just by our individual choices, but also by the communities we create and the people we choose to share our lives with.
It's like recognizing that we're not just solitary individuals struggling to make sense of the world, but we're interconnected beings who can support and inspire each other on this path towards greater understanding and fulfillment.
And that sense of interconnectedness, that realization that we're all part of something larger than ourselves, is a key theme that emerges again and again in this debate between idealism and materialism.
So even though idealism and materialism seem like opposites in a lot of ways, they both point towards this bigger picture, this sense of unity that underlies the apparent diversity of existence.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole debate so compelling. It's not about choosing one side over the other. It's about recognizing the interplay of both forces, the dance between the ideal and the material, the mind and matter, the spiritual and the physical.
It's like recognizing that the tapestry of reality is woven with threads from both. And it's that interplay of those threads that creates the beauty and complexity of the whole.
And speaking of tapestries, one of our sources dives into a really rich and complex thread, Hegelianism. It takes idealism to a whole new level.
Yeah, Hegel's definitely the heavyweight champion when it comes to idealism. But honestly, sometimes his ideas can feel like trying to climb a mental mountain. Where do we even start with this?
Well, one of the videos you share breaks it down pretty nicely. It talks about a key distinction in Hegelian thought. The difference between ideal with a lowercase I and ideal with a capital I.
Okay, lowercase versus uppercase. I'm intrigued.
It's a big deal. The lowercase ideal refers to the ideas that we all have, thoughts, concepts, daydreams. They're in our minds, but they don't necessarily have any reality outside of our minds.
Right? Like my ideal vacation might be lounging on a beach somewhere, but that doesn't mean it's actually happening unless I book the ticket.
Exactly. It's subjective and personal. But that capital I, ideal, that's a whole other thing. For Hegel, it's synonymous with the absolute idea.
The absolute idea. So we're talking about like ultimate reality here.
Precisely. The source describes it as the source of all being, the driving force behind the evolution of the universe and human consciousness.
Okay, that's big. So is Hegel saying that everything that exists is somehow connected to this ultimate, all-encompassing idea?
Yes. And he saw history as the unfolding of this absolute idea, a process where the finite and the infinite are constantly interacting and merging. It's like the universe is on this grand journey of self-discovery, and we humans are a part of that.
That's pretty mind-blowing. So it's not just that our minds are part of reality, but the universe itself is in some way conscious, working towards something.
That's a core idea in absolute idealism. It's a lot to wrap your head around, but it's also pretty exciting. How do you think those everyday ideal thoughts, those lowercase I ones, fit into this grand scheme?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. It seems like there's this huge gap between like my little daydreams and this ultimate absolute idea.
Well, Hegel believed that all those finite things, even the ones that seem purely material, are ultimately expressions of the absolute idea. They're like individual notes in a grand symphony, necessary steps in this ongoing process of the universe realizing itself.
So even something as simple as a pebble on a beach plays a role in this cosmic symphony.
Exactly. From Hegel's perspective, everything has its place and its purpose. It's all contributing to the overall harmony of existence.
I love that image. It's a powerful reminder that even the seemingly insignificant things around us are all interconnected, part of something much larger.
And that sense of interconnectedness ties back to the debate between idealism and materialism, because while those philosophies seem to be pulling in opposite directions, they both point towards this idea of unity.
Right, like Plato, with his perfect forms representing this unified reality beyond our senses. And historical materialism, showing how even our material conditions are all interwoven throughout history.
Exactly. And that brings us to another fascinating aspect of this deep dive. The way our sources highlight both the philosophical and even practical, we have those life lessons from Plato, but we also have a source that compares ancient and modern materialism.
I was really struck by that comparison. It argues that in some ways modern materialism has become a bit, well, vulgar.
That's one way to put it, but the source makes a good point. It points out that ancient materialism, as seen in figures like Democritus, was deeply rooted in contemplation. It was about seeking those fundamental, unchanging truths about the nature of matter.
Right, those tiny indivisible atoms moving in the fluid.
Exactly. But the source argues that modern materialism has kind of shifted its focus. become more about observation, measurement, and manipulating the material world through technology. Less about pondering the essence of matter and more about building things, creating new gadgets.
So instead of gazing in wonder at the stars, we're building bigger telescopes to dissect them.
It's a simplification, but it captures that shift. The source argues that this focus on the practical has led to a loss of philosophical depth in how we see the material world.
It's like we've become so busy building the machine that we've forgotten to ask what it means, why we're building it in the first place.
And the source points to another interesting contrast. Ancient materialism saw matter as eternal, unchanging. But modern materialism sees it as constantly evolving in flux.
That makes sense, given our understanding of things like physics and evolution. But where does that leave us?
The source argues that this shift has created a world where we're constantly chasing after the next new thing, the latest technological advancement, without any grounding in a deeper, more permanent reality.
It's like that feeling of always needing the newest phone, the fastest car, but never feeling truly satisfied.
Exactly. And it raises some big questions about whether this constant pursuit of material progress is actually leading us towards a more meaningful and fulfilling life.
Okay, so we've gone from Plato's perfect forms to the building blocks of the universe, from the grand sweep of history to the everyday choices we make. It's been quite a journey, so what does it all mean? What are the big takeaways?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that this debate between idealism and materialism isn't about picking a winner. It's about recognizing the complex interplay between those two forces, how they shape our understanding of ourselves and the world.
It seems like we need both lenses to see the full picture.
Yeah.
Maybe the real wisdom lies in finding a balance between those two perspectives.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're both material AD ideal beings. We're grounded in this physical world, but also capable of transcending it through our thoughts, our creativity, our aspirations.
I love that. It's like we're constantly being pulled in two directions. But maybe that tension is what makes us human, what drives us to create, to explore, to evolve.
And ultimately, I think this deep dive has shown us that philosophy isn't just some abstract academic pursuit. It's about asking those big questions. The questions that have been echoing through human history for centuries. Questions about who we are, why we're here, and what it all means.
And those questions, those deep dives into the nature of reality can lead us to some really profound insights about how to live a more meaningful and fulfilling life.
That's the beauty of philosophy. It's not about finding all the answers, but about embracing that journey of exploration, of questioning, of seeking deeper understanding.